Okay, I have the unenviable position of stopping you before lunch. So lock the doors. And I also am aware you've all been sitting down for quite some time, so I'm not going to ask you to stand up, though, 'cause that seems unfair. But if you want to. I obviously have something to do for you before I actually get into the main body of the talk. But before I get going, I'd like anyone who's planning to do microservices to raise their hand. Well, there's a fair few. I'm not going to ask you what they are yet. That would be interesting. Who's already done microservices and it's all working in production and you're happy bunnies? That last one was left there, just hanging. Okay, I have a theory that those people who put their hand up second are slightly less impressed by what microservices ended up being. So we'll see that. Hopefully this little song I'm going to do for you now, just to warm you up, is for those people who put their hand up and perhaps have done microservices well or not so well. So give me a second to make sure this is working. It was working a minute ago. I'm pretty sure it'll work now. Again, talk amongst yourselves. There's no rush. It's lunch. This is where, if it doesn't work, I go down in such awesome flames. That's better. And we're done. That's all I wanted. Just once, do that. Okay. Has everyone been there? So I have to stop it, otherwise you're going to see me recording it. And it's embarrassing what I look like at home when I'm doing this. Just ask my partner, she's in the front row, she'll tell you how embarrassed she was when she came home, told our son, look, he's working hard, as I'm sitting there with a guitar, with headphones on, looking a bit silly. Hard at work. Okay, so that's eaten up a good chunk of time. That's nice. So microservices, I have a technical talk to discuss with you. I'm going to share some of the points of the journey I've been along. And it's fair to say that I'm now part of a company called Go Microservices. And what we do is help people go microservices. It's a great name. It makes a great deal of sense to me. But we do have a problem in microservices land because, to some degree, it's a bit like that. Particularly if you've been on a journey towards them. In fact, most of the companies I'm working with right now have gone with microservices and are complaining somewhat about it, and correctly so, because they've been on a big, expensive, painful journey, and they've hit a hump. They've hit what I call the adoption hump. It's similar to the adoption hump that happens in a lot of agile adoptions. What happens is loads of people put loads of money in, and then they say, what have we got for it? And no one has a good answer, because the system hasn't changed much. And in those cases, what's usually gone a little bit wrong is they've forgotten why they were doing it in the first place. They got so focused on the minutiae, the detail of the whole escapade. You know, is it restful? Who cares? Those sorts of things. They get so locked into those things that actually they've forgotten that we were trying to get something better out of this system than we had before. So some of this talk is going to be technical. I'm going to give you some patterns. And those that came on the workshop I did yesterday, you've already seen some of those patterns. But I'm going to tell you about these patterns that I see constantly in mature-ish microservice deployments. At the same time, though, I'd like to help you avoid failing at doing it, because, frankly, it's much more fun to work with clients where it's going better than that. So, first of all, let's start with a definition. Personally, my favorite definition of microservices begins like this. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field, though it is the smallest of all seeds. Yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds come and perch in its branches. That makes it clear. If there's one thing you take away from this talk, I'm hoping it's that. And you can find that online. Okay, so one of the other definitions you come out there is loosely coupled services that can change. Can change. That tends to be the key. Can we build a system where the systemic properties are such that we can not only become robust and resilient, all those qualities that we look for in our software, but we can actually handle change happening? Because it's one of the stories I like to tell in my course, which is, you know, the elephant in the stand-up. The fact that when you go to your stand-up and someone says, I'd like one small change, and it ends up being that moment where everyone looks slightly uncomfortable because it isn't a small change, although it could have been. And you have two directions you can go at that point. You can get all platonic about it and think, with more thought, the architecture would have been better. The design would have been, what we need next time is more time. Which you're never going to get. But yeah, next time we won't do this. And then the next time you do something else and the same problem happens. And I call it the elephant in the stand-up because it's all the code that you've written up until that day that is now in dramatic conflict with reality. The reality that things change. And so it's time, I think, and one of the things I like about microservices is it puts at the forefront this idea of constructing software, designing software, so that it is ready for change. Just ready. Just enough. The problem with microservices is the very term. I hate it. Microservices. Honestly, it's not about size. And it's not just me saying that. It's not about size. And interestingly, it's not even about the pieces. The size of your microservices, people get obsessed about this. It's got to be this many lines of code, or we're all going to hell. It's not a microservice anymore. I can honestly say I've seen microservices with many, many lines of code and hardly any. And either way, I don't care. And I don't think anyone in business really cares either. what tends to be more important is not the things, but the things that happen in the system and overall the systemic properties that we're aiming for. And when I see a successful adoption of microservices in the broader sense, it's usually because people are reminding themselves of what they actually wanted the system to do. It's not what you have, it's what you can do with it. Okay. So the big challenge is that different companies will have different needs. And so again, when it comes to dogmatic adoption of microservices, be careful of copying the wrong companies. You are not Netflix, unless you are, by the way, sorry if you. But generally speaking, you're probably not Netflix. You probably don't have quite the same cultural makeup. You don't have the same technology stack. You don't necessarily have the same business objectives. So copying an architectural style verbatim, including the tool set, probably won't get you as much value as you think. You need to think about it in a different way. So do you value stability? Some companies really do. In fact, some products. There's a great blog post by Simon Wardley on this, about the fact that he looks at the lifetime of a product, and his argument is that the process you apply will vary across the life of a product. At the beginning, when you're discovering it, deciding what it is, getting it wrong, which is learning, right? When you're doing all that, that's complicated and agile. Then later on, chances are things stabilize a little bit, in most cases. So maybe then a different process would be more valuable, valuing different things. So stability might be your game. Have you ever thought about where your product is, where your company is at, in terms of, is it valuing stability? Because it's at that point in its life. Some value speed. This is where Netflix came from. They wanted to be fast. They had to be fast, they had to be nimble, they had to be faster than the competitors. It was their edge, competitive advantage. The problem is if you turn around to a company and say, do you want speed? They'll say yes. Even if they don't. Because why would you not want it? Well, I'll tell you why you wouldn't want it. You try telling someone who's going around a corner too fast that what they actually don't want is speed now, because what they're going to do is slide off and careen off the road. So speed might be something you value, but it isn't a default. Some value adaptability. Can we change? Can we adapt to what's going on? In fact, it's not how fast we go, it's how quickly we can pivot to get to the next stage. So that might be the value you've got. Some value volatility. We actually want to make the whole system volatile because good things might happen in here. We want to constrain things to cause innovation to happen. I used to be involved in innovation consultancy, and the biggest message I can give to you is don't put money into it. It's amazing how innovative people are when they have no money. Honestly, I used to have these whole forums of people going, yeah, we had a budget cut, and that really made it happen. I'm not saying do that. If anyone's here in budget control, and don't want you to go away and just do that. Requires a little more. And some value this term that I go on about, which is antifragility. And it's not that complex a term, really. It's a fancy term for, in the event of stress being entered into a system, the system can improve. And that's at the heart of why we have things like the Simian Army and the chaos monkeys of this world. Because what they're there to do is to introduce stress. Introduce stress into the development teams so that they design their software to cope with these problems. Mainly because, as a modern architect, you probably want to be a bit lazy. As a modern lead in this respect, it's actually one of those little tricks you can apply. Rather than tell people or govern people to do something, introduce a stress such that if they don't follow your dictates, they will fall foul of it. And that's essentially all the Simian Army is. It's trying to keep people doing the right thing. Okay, so the trick with microservices is that they can enable speed, agility, and antifragility, depending on what you want. You notice I didn't include stability there. Okay, it doesn't introduce. Making a system massively distributed doesn't generally increase the stability of the system. If you think it does, try it. So I wouldn't recommend that one to people. If you want a stable system, go monolith. Oh yeah, that'll be stable, like a rock. And that might be what you want. And in fact, those that came on the course yesterday will know that I teach how to build a better monolith before I go anywhere near microservices. because I want a monolith that can be as good as possible, because during that early phase of a project, I'm discovering I don't know what I'm doing. In fact, that should be a mantra. As developers, you may have heard this before. The mantra is, I don't know what I'm doing, and the customer doesn't know what they want. That's normal. If there's one thing you take away from this talk, take that one away. Okay, but how do we do this? How do we do it? So here's some patterns for you, because I don't have much time today. I'm going to share some patterns. The Superman of this story is DDD. DDD, not BDD. Please don't confuse it for Dan stuff. It's DDD, domain-driven design, which unfortunately has a checkered history to some degree. Mainly it has a checkered history because of an anti-pattern I call the domain objects at the center of the universe. What it is where someone has created a collection of classes that someone has gone to the absolute pain to try and object and relationally map into a database, for some reason, and then wrapped it in a library, because no one else wants to do this, and then everyone's using it. Do you know what they call that? Coupling to everything. No one wants to change that because everything else ripples. Fred Brooks would punch you for creating that. And he's not a violent man as far as I'm aware. So yeah, in DDD, I don't mean domain objects. I'm avoiding the whole domain objects problem. I'm actually thinking about something very different. And I'm thinking about events. So when I'm working with my clients, when we're designing the system, one of the things we focus on very early are what are the events in the system? What are the things that happen? Not the things. The things themselves, whether we've got microservices or macroservices or mini-lifts. Whoa, terminology overload. Doesn't really matter. What are the events in the system? And it turns out that most stakeholders are happy talking about an event. This happened. That happened. Events are just facts, immutable facts that we can use. In fact, there's a nice overlap here. If anyone's working in big data, because is anyone working in big data and microservices? Because that's got to be some sort of bingo. But the interesting thing is the overlap between the two systems. I often get asked, what's the minimal amount of data that you would keep in a big data scenario? An event. I would describe an event, and that would be enough. So there, if there's one thing you take, anyway. Okay, as well as events, I have event lakes. I do not call them data lakes, because if I call them data lakes, they become data swamps. So what they are event lakes. I actually store my events in a lake, because I don't know what I'm doing yet. I don't know what the answer is yet, and I need to adapt to it. So I don't yet know what microservices I'm going to use with these events, but I'm going to keep them. It's kind of like the hoarder's paradise. Okay, so I keep all my events in an event lake, and then I have streams. Streams of events that I then apply projections to. I have aggregates that are optimized for updates, so I have a transactional service. Then I have no more conversations about how a microservice-based system becomes consistent. The answer is eventually. Always. In fact, it's how reality works. It's how your database is working. It will be eventually consistent internally. Not very quick, but it's eventually consistent. Okay, on top of that, I have views. I have means of presenting to the outside world. I have commands and queries as my two main different types of events. None of this is new. This has all been going around for a long time. Look up CQRS, look up anything by Greg Young. These are the patterns of microservices. Okay, when you're asking yourself, what are my microservices? Start with that. What are the patterns I'm trying to apply? Aggregates, views, event streams. Adapters, gateways. All of these things are in Enterprise Integration Patterns, the book, which, by the way, if you want to write a book that can be very expensive, always include the E word. And then there's a secret sauce. That is actually McDonald's secret sauce. That's the Big Mac sauce. It looks lovely, doesn't it? We have event sourcing now. If we have events in there, we can do sourcing based upon them. We can interpret those events differently at a later date with different projections. We can build microservices as people come up with new ideas about how they want to interpret the events we have, or we capture new events. We don't throw any away because we don't know what the answers are that we need to calculate yet. And that's why we need projections. I'm old enough to remember these things. The old transparency we had to learn to write upside down. Is anyone good at that? I was terrible. Okay, so going beyond patterns, very quickly for you. Think about and visualize change. You notice I'm not really talking much about how many lines of code there is in a microservice at this point. Think about and visualize change. If that's what you value, think about change. Just thinking, having that premeditation, just that small amount of consideration of change on your system. Don't assume, like Plato, that you're creating up with the perfect ideal system. You're just not, because that ball's moving. Okay, so think about and visualize change. I have the Life Preserver tool that I bang on about. There's plenty of examples online that you could use about how to just visualize change, just thinking about it. It's nice to aim for you write it, you run it. Some organizations can. In some companies, if you write it and run it, you go to prison. Generally not allowed. Certainly in banks, there's an element of, if you write it and you run it, yes, you probably be foul of several regulatory concerns, and off you go. But if you can aim for it, and certainly Dan was talking about how you take responsibility for that, you become aware of it, that's a great dictate to follow. Again, let's not worry about the size of the services necessarily. Having continuously deliverable, independent pieces or services. Things that can roll out as quickly as you want them to. It's a big deal on the whole process side of it. Test services in a language and platform-independent manner. This means that you will write more integration tests than you were probably ever comfortable with. But that's okay, because what you want are tests that tell you what the contract to your service is. So if you go ahead and deliver a new version of the service, if it doesn't work, it doesn't get rolled out. Not particularly difficult stuff. There is actually an interesting side effect to this. A lot of the companies I'm working with are actually mandating now that your tests have to be written in an entirely different platform from your code. Simply to stop you doing low-level unit testing and make sure you're testing the contract to the service. And probably a big one, actually generally in our industry, is don't copy, please. There's so many ills in this industry from copying. Copying from other industries, copying from other companies. Your context is unique. Whether microservices will help or not depends on what you value. I mentioned that earlier. But I would strongly advise you to look carefully at your context before you adopt an architectural style that may be unsuitable. This is a bit negative about microservices, isn't it? I'm sorry about that. And consider anti-fragility early. If you want to build a system that thrives on change, doesn't just embrace change, thrives on it, thrives on the stresses that could be applied to it, thrives on discovering new features, then anti-fragility is the overriding concern there. So I'm just hopefully making you, if you take one thing away, then you might want to take away anti-fragility as well. If you want more on this, as I'm running out of time, I am putting together a toolbox, little open source toolbox of how to do microservices with DDD. There are other examples out there as well, but I basically got a little bit dissatisfied with how hard it was to collate these things. So I'm kind of curating a set of open source projects that will help you do microservices using these DDD concepts, and hopefully, you know, starting to achieve the values that you need in your organization. There is, of course, my book. There's always a sales pitch for the book. Which I tell you what, I will put up a link to the book, right? I will put up a link. If you follow me on Twitter, at Russ Miles, I warn you, I binge tweet. You have nothing from me for months, and then I'll completely fill your timeline with inane nothing. I just warn you of that. But what I will do is after the conference, I will tweet a link to the book that will be a free copy. So just go, and in perpetuity. So just go and grab a copy of the book, and eventually I'll have finished it. Okay, so there's one last thing that I think I just want you to take away. One last thing. A little bit on anti-fragility, I suppose. You see, it's all very well me standing up here on stage and talking about anti-fragility and saying, you should have go and consider this. But there is an ethic. There's an ethical argument to anti-fragility. And that ethical argument is, I should have skin in the game. Ask this next time you're working with a consultant, whether they really have skin in your game at all. The advice they're offering, do they stand to actually have any issue at all if it goes wrong? That's what skin in the game feels like. So I feel like I probably need to ethically have a bit of skin in the game when I advise anti-fragility. It turns out anti-fragility comes with two analogies. The first analogy is a muscle in the human body. You go to a gym, you destroy your muscle, and then it gets better. Hopefully you don't go too far. But yeah, if you go to the gym, you're convincing your body you're now on Jupiter, and the muscle improves. This is the definition of an anti-fragile system. You punish it, it gets better. Think 50 shades of microservices, and you'll be about there. Okay. So I need skin in the game, but there is another analogy that I quite like. And that analogy is in human relationships. You see, in human relationships, there is this thing we call love. Bet you didn't think you'd go there before lunch. There is this thing called love. And what it means to be in love is to have a relationship that will meet the stresses of reality and improve, hopefully. That's my loose definition. Think about writing a book on it. Then again, I'm thinking about writing the book that you just saw. I'm still working on that one too. So, in order to have skin in the game, I probably need to show you what that looks like. And to do that, I'm going to have to ask someone to marry me. So 1 second. Just give me a moment. Talk amongst yourselves. I'm shaking. I'm going to drop it. And with that, I only have to wish you a lovely lunch, and I intend to go and drink champagne. So have a great day.